Well, good evening. As I look out on you tonight, it reminds me of a dream that I had 36 years ago, about 36 years ago, of starting a firm which would be a fiduciary, which would give high quality service and would have the phones ringing constantly. There was the little ringing then because I was in one room by myself and began with a few clients. Now the phones ring all the time, sometimes even at 8:30 at night, and with substantive stuff, and on weekends. Our firm has grown significantly, and I have joked about we have over 40 people. And I've joked about having a balcony put on our our conference room, to fit all these people. But let's move on to our guest speaker. A key to all of our investment work is what will the economy be like? We are fortunate to have a forward-looking economist, Stuart Mackintosh, to provide us with insight. Dr. Mackintosh is past president of the National Association for Business Economics, the largest professional organization of economists in the U.S., and an elected member of the prestigious Conference of Business Economists. He is currently executive director of the group of 30 whose members are at the highest level of private and public sectors and academia around the world. You would know their names. He received his PhD from Newcastle in Scotland. He has written one book and is doing another one on the broad topics that touch on economics, finance, and perhaps political systems. So without further ado, let's get started.
It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you to Lou and to Karen and to Andrew. It's a lovely evening to be here with you today. And I do want to start with a sort of an admission as the type of presentation I'm going to give you. I'm American, but I am originally Scottish. So I'm a bit pessimistic in my outlook. I'm an economist, so we tend to look on the downside. And working with central bankers, we're always looking at the risks, looking over this. So you very rarely have a meeting, or I very rarely have a meeting where we say, things are fabulous, don't worry. and as a Scot, and my grandfather was a Presbyterian minister in the Free Church of Scotland, and so that pessimism is deeply imbued in my genetics. And I have a small book, I don't have it with me, but I have memorized parts of it. It's called The Wee Book of Calvin. And it's whenever I feel too optimistic, as if I'm becoming too American, I pick up the book and I delve into it for little nuggets of wisdom. So let me just give you two. One is, dinna expect anything and you will not be disappointed. And my personal favorite, darkness will keep through the smallest hole. So I say that by way of intro to give you a sense of that my talk may not be entirely uplifting and positive. Now, according to surveys of business CEOs, and policy uncertainty and trade conflict, populism, geopolitical uncertainty are increasingly mentioned as top threats for growth. We've already heard some of that discussion already. And looking at economic indicators today, it's easy to understand their unease. Growth is weak in Europe, and vulnerabilities are appearing in China. The US economy is relatively strong, but the occupants of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue may be increasing uncertainty. And the business cycle is not dead. Geopolitics is becoming increasingly unpredictable at a time when policy solutions need to become smarter, more innovative, faster. At the same time, our political systems appear paralyzed and in disrepute across the developed world. So let me first begin by highlighting some short-term risks and some medium-term uncertainties, and then move to longer-term risks. So in the short term, of course, we are approaching the end of the business cycle. And there is increasing market sentiment that we may be seeing a recession sooner rather than later. Now, of course, the US economy is wrapping up its 39th quarter of uninterrupted growth. This ties the 1991-2001 record for being the longest period of expansion in the history of the United States. So let's not be too negative. But while the economic expansions don't die of old age, some indicators in the US may suggest that we may be approaching the end of that business cycle. Business sentiments have slipped a little bit since January. The yield curve inversion may be signaling a recession is in the offing. In housing, we're seeing some weakness there. And the outlook elsewhere across the globe is worse, not better. Europe is currently growing at only 1.1%, and it may be affected by what's known as the Japanese disease of perpetual slow growth. In some respects, indeed, European countries are in an even worse situation than Japan. Many European countries face higher rates of unemployment than Japan, and unlike Japan, individual countries of the Eurozone have no autonomy over their monetary policy, and therefore cannot depreciate their way out of the problem and become more competitive. Instead, they have to slash domestic wages. And China is slowing, and that's to be expected, as shifts from an export-led to a consumer-led growth is part of a maturing economy. But when China slows, the world can catch a cold. And in Japan, Abe's three arrows of reform have been fired, but the results have failed to ensure the economy's long-run growth rate will improve, and inflation remains very low, wages subdued, and firms reluctant to invest in the shrinking market. So faced by this, we have to ask ourselves, do central banks have the policy maneuver when the recession hits? Well, in the fiscal realm, governments are already running massive budget deficits. The US is currently running a 1.1 trillion deficit, and in the European Union, they have the other problem, which is they're restricted in their fiscal stimulus by a thing called the Growth and Stability Pact, by German strictures. So in terms of monetary policy, interest rates in the advanced economies remain very low indeed. Central banks will have to figure out how they can stimulate the economy when facing the next recession, given the very limited room to maneuver. Now, one option is to implement negative interest rates, and Bank of Japan and the ECB have already done so. But of course, that's not very popular amongst savers and people who are headed towards retirement. And central bank balance sheets are also massively larger than they were prior to the global financial crisis. In the US, the Fed has about 4 trillion in assets, and the ECB and Japan both have approximately 5 trillion in assets. That's larger than Japan's GDP. So when the cycle turns, will we have enough room to maneuver and boost the economy as much as we need? Both fiscal and monetary policy, I would argue, lack the room to do so. So I worry about that in the short term. And unfortunately, I expect when that recession hits, because business cycles still exist, truth could become a casualty. I ask you, will our president take the downturn like a man and deal with reality, or will he deny it and attack the messengers, the statisticians, the economists, and the leadership of the Federal Reserve? I think we know the answer. You and I, as investors and citizens, need to defend reality in that case. We must reject the idea that there are such things as alternative facts. Each person is entitled to their own opinion, but not their own facts. We all, as investors, economists, voters, need to be ready to reject such claims. After all, facts matter. As Winston Smith said in George Orwell's 1984, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 + 2 makes 4. If that is granted, all else follows. Or as Orwell also said in an unpublished preface to Animal Farm, quote, freedom is the ability to tell people things they don't want to know. So in the short term, growth is fragile, policy options are limited, And there's worries about how people in power will react to the downturn when it happens. What about the medium term? Well, in the medium term, debt levels are up, and I worry about that. Corporate debts and the debt levels in the major economies have ballooned since the global financial crisis. US corporate debt is at an all-time high of 74% of GDP. In Europe, similar figures are 83% of GDP in the UK, as high as 145% in France, 155% in Sweden. In Japan, the corporate debt rate is about 100% of GDP. And in China, the debt levels have reached 150% of GDP. This is just non-financial corporate debt. This doesn't include financial corporate debt or government debt. Now, of course, with stable earnings and low interest rates, servicing this debt is not a problem. But of course, that could quickly change if there's a major downturn. And high debts can also lead to sovereign and corporate defaults. History shows us this, and we can already see it in the emerging markets under stress, in Turkey, in Argentina, in South Africa, and elsewhere. And as an investor, I would be vigilant to signs of distress in emerging markets, and which provide an alarm or an opportunity depending on which side you stand. Let me say a few words about shadow banking. Shadow banking is essentially any institutions that perform the acts of banking outside the banking system. A lot has been done to sort of rein in that type of behavior, which was precipitous of the global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. But by 2017, shadow banking globally is now accounting for 52 trillion in financial assets, 16% of total global financial assets. Maturity transformation outside banking, which is what this is, tends to end in tears and recriminations. Think about WeWork, a non-bank maturity transformation in action. When the business cycle turns, this will get ugly. I see a huge increase in the issuance of collateralized loan obligations with echoes of 2006 and 2007. Non-banks acting like banks can outmaneuver their heavily regulated rivals in short term. And China is leading the pack in experimentation in risk and in regulation. Peer-to-peer lending became hugely popular in China in the last few years. Chinese middle classes gambling with their futures. These were unregulated. Many were scams with elements of get-rich-quick schemes with no capital requirements. By 2017, there was 250 billion in lending via approximately 6,000 peer-to-peer platforms, equivalent to 30% of new bank lending in China at that point. However, by 2019, there were approximately only 1,300 peer-to-peer platforms remaining operating in China. Most of the peer-to-peer lending investors lost their shirts. But there has been no systemic risk, but big losses. And China continues to allow non-bank evolution much faster than the US. It's an irony that you have a state capitalist-driven system which permits this degree of risk-taking. China has more than 200 non-bank payment platforms. I mean, in many establishments, if you've been to Beijing or Shanghai, you simply cannot pay with cash anymore. You walk in with paper cash, as I had done, and they look at you like you're an idiot. So as this rapid technological transformation takes place and we move more towards shadow banking and non-banks play a larger role, risks may rise, but regulation must be willing to step in. Incumbent rent seekers will seek their margins shrink and be disrupted, but this is a normal process, albeit sped up by and potentially globalized. And this is taking place at a time when, indeed, globalization, anti-globalization is on the rise. And that's where I worry. I worry that the populist wave is set to continue. Within this backlash, can the US reach a meaningful conclusion with China that will last? I don't think so. The US-China trade war is part of that anti-globalization politics. It is also symptomatic of our relative decline and China's rise. China's rise will be and is being resisted by the United States. In this sense, Steve Bannon is right. This is the clash of the 21st century. Unfortunately, populism will not swiftly disappear from our global politics and national politics. Brexit will continue to wreak havoc in Britain. Sadly, it gives me a headache every day I think about it. Nationalism and neo-fascist parties garner successes in Sweden and now even Spain and elsewhere in Europe. In Hungary and Poland, anti-establishment and autocratic and anti-democratic governments are in power and breaking democratic norms. Outside the West, nationalist populism is growing in Brazil, India, and elsewhere. All of this is part of a widespread anti-globalization backlash. And the movement is already costing us in terms of global growth. In 2018, it was estimated that uncertainty caused by trade frictions reduced US growth by about 0.3%. The Chinese government believes that the clash with the US could hinder its growth by between 0.5 and 1% going forward. And the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank cites the US trade war as the single biggest threat facing Asian economies going forward. The OECD has said similar. And let me confess that many of us, myself included, have taken globalization for granted. We forgot that for many winners, there are also losers. And we did too little, if anything, for those losers. So more needs to be done to address the concentrated downside of globalization that lifts most boats. We should also take care to not forget that the era of hyperglobalization that we live in at the moment has only been a relative blink of an eye. From the First World War, the last peak of globalization, we had a massive collapse in trade as a percentage of GDP, thanks to the wars, thanks to Smoot-Hawley, thanks to tit-for-tat mercantilism. That collapse only came back to the same level as it was at the start of the First World War in 1970. So you had a huge period where we were basically playing catch-up on globalization. And this teaches me that globalization and its benefits are not politically or economically inevitable. They can be reversed and placed in retreat, especially when a hegemon declines or refuses to lead and the rules and security erode. So can trade and prosperity. So complacency on globalization and rules-based system is foolish. We will all suffer if we enter a zero-sum, I win, you lose approach to trade and economics. Now let me turn briefly to the longer term. What about demographics? Well, they say demographics is destiny, and that's right. It's a long-range, slow-moving, but practically irresistible dynamic. Plan now and deal with it later, or don't plan now and deal with it much more painfully later. The former will always be easier than the latter. Across most of the world, fertility rates are falling and populations are aging. Japan has been the archetypal example of a country with a shrinking, aging population. Japan is shrinking at the rate of one large city a year. 13% of Japan's housing is now unoccupied. Only 60% of the population is of working age. Japan is taking steps to address this working participation, birth rates, immigration, and so on, but the totality of the push is not enough to stop the downward spiral. And America is aging too, with dependency ratios rising. China faces similar dynamics driven by their one-child policy. China is, in essence, racing to get rich quick before it gets old. Economists like Adair Turner and Charles Goodhart argue that slowing population growth may actually help reduce the job threats from automation and have other positive effects. After all, shrinking populations cause tighter labor markets, allowing for rising wages, which can boost productivity and economic growth. And indeed, just such a widespread phenomenon occurred in Europe after the Black Death in the Middle Ages, when the plague wiped out large parts of the European peasantry, allowing the remaining alive peasants to demand higher wages or move on. These demographic shifts are unavoidable and will pose challenges, such as how to sustain our pension systems and care for our elderly selves and our parents. But there will also be opportunities, longer and different, productive, happier working lives. Go to Japan, you can see it. The result is not necessarily a dystopian nightmare. We can change how we work, we can do what we do, and what societies value and invest in. That may be robots, new systems, new skills. We can foster younger immigrant workforce. We will have longer, healthier working lives. We can save more during those lives. Successful management of demographics destiny will require all of these actions and more together, because there are no corner solutions to this risk. Closing our eyes to reality is always, of course, a possibility, but not a prudent one. And closing our eyes to the one remaining mega risk in our futures can no longer be allowed. Of course, I'm talking about climate change. As Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England, not a revolutionary tree hugger, I can attest, warned in 2015, climate change is the mega risk of our collective future. For you cannot assure economic stability if you face ecological crisis. Rising sea levels, more frequent powerful hurricanes in the Atlantic, cyclones in the Pacific, record and rising temperatures globally, from Australia to Europe to the Arctic. Last month, indeed, scientists discovered that the world's largest ice shelf, Antarctica's Ross Ice Shelf, is melting 10 times faster than previously expected, with huge implications for sea levels. We are warned of 1 million species threatened with extinction in this new Anthropocene era. We should learn from history that climate change can cause the collapse of empires and civilizations. Kyle Harper argues convincingly in his excellent The Fate of Rome that the sudden long period of colder, drier climate change in Europe precipitated crop failure in Egypt, the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, refugee flows, societal collapse at the edge, but ultimately at the core of the Roman Empire. And it can happen again. And now for the good news. I feel like the political and business cycle and central banking narrative is finally shifted. Polls show a majority of Americans believe climate change is underway and want action by their policymakers. The Paris Agreement has been signed. Political leaders in the G20 recognize what they must do to limit climate change to a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial era. Today, most company boards in the world's largest companies view climate change as a risk they must regularly discuss and act on as a business issue. And today, 34 of the world's largest and most important central banks have agreed, not today literally, but you know what I mean, that action on climate must be part of sustaining economic growth going forward. And today, our children and grandchildren strike for action and cut through our mealy-mouthed discussion with childhood clarity. Can we manage it? Technically, yes. But action must be taken sooner, not later, to arrest it. Because waiting will make the political and societal dislocations far worse. And climate change, of course, will have huge immediate economic cost. The melting of the Arctic permafrost, if that occurs, would cost the global economy $70 trillion. Or to put it another way, research suggests that for every year we delay action on climate change, the costs increase by almost 1% of global output. By acting now, though, we can solve what Larry Summers has often talked about, the secular stagnation you hear reported on, in investment opportunities that will be significant and richer than at present, because the retooling to a post-carbon economy will not only be a short-term cost, but a major important long-term engine of growth. Moving to this economy is the next industrial revolution. Think about Y2K. That small investment that everybody made in their technological and their computing systems now 2 decades back, that helped drive the growth of the 2000s. The retooling of the economies, the reskilling, the capital and human investment needed will create the basis for a long-term, arguably multi-decade period of growth. Good for investors, good for all of us. And countries and firms who invest in the carbon neutral future will be the winners financially and economically. That is precisely why China is aggressively investing in green technologies and in batteries. In solar, for instance, China is the world leading production, export, and installation of solar panels. It aims to produce 50% of its energy from non-fossil fuels, including nuclear and renewable, by 2030. That's not a long ways away. And in wind, by 2030, China aims to have 210 gigawatts of grid-connected wind energy capability. That's far and above anything that America or Europe has. Pick almost any measure, and China has set targets it will likely meet. So we have to ask ourselves, which side do we want to be on? The laggards threatening our stability and the future, or the leaders? Make no mistake, climate change is the single biggest medium and long-term risk we face, economic and otherwise. It's also a huge opportunity we can grasp to power our economics and societies in the decades ahead. But as I said at the outset, I'm a Scot and a Calvinist and an economist, a pessimist. So I need to add one final warning, and it's not my own, but from the UN and the World Bank. According to the UN, there are 40 million internally displaced people and 25 million refugees in the world, double the amount there were in 2005. Temperature-driven migration has arguably hastened the collapse of Rome. It could jeopardize our own stability in the years ahead. According to the World Bank, desertification and extreme weather alone will result in 140 million displaced people by 2050. Think about that for a minute. This is about societal and economic costs of state collapse, of social disruption, of economic dislocation. If you think the troubles we're having at the southern border of America today are difficult, or in the Mediterranean are difficult for Europe, my goodness, we ain't seen nothing yet. So we face some short-term risks, recession this year or next. Am I worried? Not really. We face more significant challenges in the medium term, systemic risks on new technologies as the economy evolves, populism and anti-globalism, complaints about that must be addressed with real solutions while we defend the rules-based system upon which our prosperity rests. And we need to confront head-on, long-run mega risks to our society, emanating whether they are demographic or climate change. We can do it. We have the solutions. We have the technologies. I sound like I'm something from Star Wars, don't I? We just need to face the facts and deal with reality and address them head-on. Thank you.
All right, would you put down your questions? How optimistic are you that we, the country which in the past has been the most flexible, will rise to the occasion?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, I being an adoptive, a new American, I see that flexibility and I see our ability to solve those problems, and I think and I know we can do it. But sometimes when I'm communing with my Scots nature, I feel like, oh my God, the problems are huge. But then I'm reminded of my mother, who was, although she was a pessimistic Scottish doctor, she was also deeply positive about the future. I'm named after her older brother, Stuart, who was born before penicillin had been discovered. And he got a cold when he was a baby, and he died. And she remembers that. My mother also helped treat people in the last major outbreak of smallpox in Africa. You know, there is so much that we're doing that is incredibly positive and incredibly dynamic. We definitely can get this right in America and elsewhere. But it is upsetting and frustrating to be constantly bashing up against systems and failure to recognize what for most of us is elements of reality, you know, dealing with reality. But so I think we can answer the issues that confront America, notwithstanding that it makes many of us frustrated in the short to medium term, yes.
And what do you see as the outlook for U.S. corporate profits over the next several years?
Well, I'm not really well placed I keep myself very macro, so I have a confession, which is that economists are not very good at forecasts, but they're supposed to forecast. But I think, you know, as I said, this growth spurt will not die of old age necessarily. But I am worried about the yield inversion. My colleagues who are much closer to it than I say that, well, yeah, every time you get that, then 12 to 18 months later, you're going to get a downturn. Of course, we have to remember that the corporations are in a very, generally speaking, a much stronger position than they were going into the GFC. So I can't answer the question directly. it's a little outside my bailiwick. Sorry.
It's okay, but you appear to. Am I correct that you appear to be constructive on productivity as long as we approach the future and as we have approached the past? After all, we got past the
Yes.
Black Plague and we took people off farms.
Yes.
And did many other challenging things.
Yes, this is the biggest. Well, first of all, in the very recent months, we've seen a little bit of an improvement in productivity. So that's good news because Robert Gordon's mega treatise on productivity, which basically argues it's all over, there's no more opportunity. I mean, you think I'm pessimistic, you should read that. But then I didn't realize that he had been saying the same things. His book that came out with just, I suppose, 2 years ago, which is a great book, which I recommend, basically arguing that productivity's over, the hell's coming, don't worry, pack your bags. That book was basically the thesis he wrote 50 years ago. It just means he's been saying the same things for long enough that it became true. I don't. So there is a possibility. There are worries that what may be happening in a winner-take-most economy is that you have a small number of very large, extremely productive firms like Facebook, Google, to a lesser extent Amazon, but still Amazon, and so on, who have a small number of workers, so on, and huge market cap. So in terms of the wealth created by each worker, it's colossal. And they are paid huge sums, but there are only very few of them. And the level of investment that you need to put into that firm to produce a new unit of output is essentially zero. If I have Facebook, anytime somebody downloads Facebook, it doesn't cost me anything. I don't have to create a car. So there is a genuine question about, well, can you have a circumstance where you have a small part of the economy performing incredibly well, and then the rest of the economy sort of a bit stagnant? So that is possible, and it may be happening to a certain extent now, but it's also possible to take those new technologies and make people far more productive. And new skills will come to the fore. Like there's a solid argument that our medical systems will change what they value in terms of productivity. So you will see doctors becoming less valuable and hands-on care becoming more valuable. And that there will be all these new technologies that enable us to be more productive. So I'm mixed on that. I think I worry about the productivity conundrum, but I do think we can avoid the worst effects of it.
Okay. I have a question. Does China have a political will that exists now nowhere in the West?
They do have certain types of levers that we don't have, not least their monetary policy levers. Because when you talk to central bankers in America or in Europe, they consistently complain that the monetary policy lever doesn't work so well because they changed the interest rate, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the banks instantly start lending and people start having a good time. It works like that in China. The PBOC gets a call from Xi Jinping because it's not independent. Cut the reserve requirement, start lending. Yes, sir. They start lending. They tell the banks to start lending. They immediately start lending. I mean, so that's a benefit of a state-run economy, I suppose. But there are lots of downsides to that we wouldn't want to have and shouldn't want to have. Not least their new innovation, which is what's called the social score, where everyone in China is going to be given a social score. They're going to be monitored on CCTV so that using algorithms so that they can be identified as they're walking around the streets. So if there's already a region in China where they're rolling it out. So if you jaywalk in that region and you're Chinese, the cameras are recognizing you, and it will pop up on the screen. It will say, "Stuart, stop jaywalking," and then your social score goes. So China is trying to pull off with AI something that was hitherto thought of as not being possible, which is to run a massive, modern, developed economy in a non-democracy.
What will be the cause of the next recession? Not real estate, but what else?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're right. I don't think it will be real estate. Thank goodness. And maybe that suggests, therefore, that the recession will be less severe. Because I would commend to you Amir Sufi's and Atif Man's book, The House of Debt, where he basically explains why housing is at the root of all major economic financial crises. So given that housing is relatively not problematic at the moment, the risks I see are not as huge. But when I talk to CEOs and I talk to senior people in banking, then they're not worried about the capital so much at the moment, but they're worried about these technological risks, cyber risk in particular. It keeps them all up at night, because you can imagine if you had a major breach in a systemically important bank, and money started going quickly, disappearing off to Myanmar or wherever. That bank would immediately lose its credibility, and you would have a run. And the question is, would it affect other banks as well? So there are transmission mechanisms outside banking as well, including shadow banking. I'm still modestly positive about it, though, that we are in a much better position than we were going into the global financial crisis. The regulators have done their job, and so I hope that the next recession is more like a common or garden recession rather than a very severe recession.
Why should the U.S. focus on global affairs when our biggest competitor economically, China, couldn't care less?
There are two parts to that question. I mean, I think, of course, they do care. We're sort of intimately linked with them in this trading dance that has now become a trade war. But I worry that we may get, that we're losing sight of why America leads. Now, there's a cost to being the global leader. And part of that cost is you run a system, you basically agree the rules-based system. There was an occurrence last year when there was a G7 summit at which Trump sent his team, and they have boilerplate statement at the end, a communique at the end of the summit. And every summit of the G7 since God knows when, basically since the beginning, always says, we reaffirm the importance of a rules-based international system. And he refused, the US government refused to sign that communique for the first time ever because they were opposed to the notion of a rules-based system. My goodness. It's in our interest. We pay a small price in the sense that as the sort of chairer or the convener of the global system, we have to give a bit here and give a bit there. But our net benefit is colossal because we then set the rules. But what I've just said now is not actually what's happening today, of course. We're abandoning that. And in abandoning that, we're costing firms money. We're costing our investors money, our voters money, because a tit-for-tat, non-rules-based system is always going to increase uncertainty and always going to be more difficult to navigate and problematic economically.
John, I'm not an expert on handwriting. You do a better job than me.
Can you shed some light on U.S. growth rates when in 2016 most economists said higher than 2 to 2.5% growth rates were impossible due to aging population and increasing rates of production?
Yeah, I think, again, this is economists are often wrong. The NABE economists that I was proud to be president of, as Trump came into office, we do a 6-monthly forecast, and we ask our professional forecasters, well, what do you think will be the impact of Trump coming to, how will this, and everyone, it's terrible, it'll be an absolute disaster. And of course they were wrong because they missed the Trump bump and they were too focused on the Trump slump. Do I think that we can grow consistently at 3%, more than 3%? I doubt it very much. So I would expect us to sort of slip back a bit, and I worry about anything that hastens the slowdown and puts at risk the otherwise relatively good performance that we're seeing, and the length of the growth spurt we've had now, which is reaching record periods. So economists got it wrong. Many economists, a majority. Do I think we can keep doing it at keep growth at over 3%? I don't think so. They will slip back. I'm not unduly concerned about that. We're at full employment already. That's great news. I think let's hope that we can sustain that running through the rest of this year and maybe into the next. I don't know beyond that.
What's the most, or if you don't know most, underappreciated factor for the United States outlook? Favorable factor for the United States.
Oh, favorable factor for the United States.
Notice what I'm trying to do there.
Yes.
I'm trying to get that as un-Scottish as I can.
Yes, I see that. Sneaky. It's sneaky. I definitely feel that the business sentiment is still relatively strong, and I think the employment situation is so good, driven by the strong economy, that I just don't see that as collapsing overnight. We're in a very good position with it, which is indicative of the overall economy. And so even if you had a slight slowdown, are we going to go into a massive recession of the likes of which we saw at the GFC, where you lost 800,000 workers per month? No, we aren't. So even if I would more like, what they say in China is that China's not going into a recession. It's a growth, a slowdown in the rate of growth. So I think that's probably what we'll see here, absent something really foolish. I mean, who knows what tweet may happen tomorrow, but.
Can you talk about the risks to our country's national security as a result of climate change?
Yeah, that's a good question. The Department of Defense have done long-standing analyses about how they need to deal with climate change, plans to move a lot of their facilities away from the coasts and things like that. They're having to deal with reality, and it definitely has implications for us, both in the United States and globally. But dealing with that becomes harder when the president and senior officials are saying, let's not discuss it at all. And so we're seeing, you can see it, the backsliding in terms of trying to erase proper analysis of the challenges ahead. It's still we're still getting good analysis, but it's under threat. And I think it's really important to have that analysis in order to make decisions about security, but also make economic decisions. If you don't have the facts, you can't make decisions. A good example of that would be, India is supposed to be the fastest growing economy in the world at the moment. It has the highest unemployment in its history. There's some disconnect there. It may be related, it's just a hypothesis. It may be related to the fact that President Modi cooked the books, and that the GDP rate that he's quoting that has no basis on, it's just not based on fact anymore. So that's an example of where, if you don't have these, if you're not aware of the facts and defending the facts and have that basis upon which to make security decisions or economic decisions, then you get into very much more difficult waters. Argentina's a case in point as well, where for years you couldn't rely on any of their economic data because everything was false.
I have one optimistic thing to say. For the first time since we've been doing this, I don't know, how many years have we been holding these annuals? We came in ahead of schedule. more time to have dessert and enjoy yourself. But before we do that, I want to give this gift to Stuart and thank him very much. Let's
Thank you
all
very
thank
much.
him very
Thank
much
you. Thank you.
for an invigorating talk.
Thank you. Thank you.